Chapter 1 of Book 1 of Les Misérables Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 1. A Few Pages of History. Chapter 1. Well Cut. 1831 and 1832, the 2 years which are immediately connected with the Revolution of July, form one of the most peculiar and striking moments of history. These 2 years rise like 2 mountains midway between those which precede and those which follow them. They have a revolutionary grandeur. Precipices are to be distinguished there. The social masses, the very assizes of civilization, the solid group of superposed and adhering interests, the century-old profiles of the ancient French formation, appear and disappear in them every instant, athwart the storm clouds of systems, of passions, and of theories. These appearances and disappearances have been designated as movement and resistance. At intervals, truth, that daylight of the human soul, can be descried shining there. This remarkable epoch is decidedly circumscribed, and is beginning to be sufficiently distant from us to allow of our grasping the principal lines even at the present day. We shall make the attempt. The Restoration had been one of those intermediate phases hard to define, in which there is fatigue, buzzing, murmurs, sleep, tumults, and which are nothing else than the arrival of a great nation at a halting place. These epochs are peculiar and mislead the politicians who desire to convert them to profit. In the beginning, the nation asks nothing but repose. It thirsts for but one thing, peace. It has but one ambition, to be small, which is the translation of remaining tranquil. Of great events, great hazards, great adventures, great men, thank God, we have seen enough. We have them heaped higher than our heads. We would exchange Caesar for Prusias, and Napoleon for the King of Yvetot. What a good little king was he! We have marched since daybreak, we have reached the evening of a long and toilsome day. We have made our first change with Mirabeau, the second with Robespierre, the third with Bonaparte. We are worn out. Each one demands a bed. Devotion which is weary, heroism which has grown old, ambitions which are sated, fortunes which are made, seek, demand, implore, solicit what? A shelter. They have it. They take possession of peace, of tranquillity, of leisure. Behold, they are content. But at the same time certain facts arise, compel recognition, and knock at the door in their turn. These facts are the products of revolutions and wars. They exist, they have the right to install themselves in society, and they do install themselves therein. And most of the time, facts are the stewards of the household and fouriers who do nothing but prepare lodgings for principles. This, then, is what appears to philosophical politicians. At the same time that weary men demand repose, accomplished facts demand guarantees. Guarantees are the same to facts that repose is to men. This is what England demanded of the Stuarts after the Protector. This is what France demanded of the Bourbons after the Empire. These guarantees are a necessity of the times. They must be accorded. Princes grant them, but in reality it is the force of things which gives them. A profound truth, and one useful to know, which the Stuarts did not suspect in 1662, and which the Bourbons did not even obtain a glimpse of in 1814. The predestined family, which returned to France when Napoleon fell, had the fatal simplicity to believe that it was itself which bestowed, and that what it had bestowed it could take back again. The House of Bourbon possessed the right divine, that France possessed nothing, and that the political right conceded in the charter of Louis XVIII was merely a branch of the right divine, was detached by the House of Bourbon and graciously given to the people until such day as it should please the king to reassume it. Still the House of Bourbon should have felt, from the displeasure created by the gift, that it did not come from it. This house was churlish to the 19th century. It put on an ill-tempered look at every development of the nation. To make use of a trivial word, that is to say, of a popular and true word, it looked glum. The people saw this. It thought it possessed strength because the empire had been carried away before it like a theatrical stage setting. It did not perceive that it had itself been brought in the same fashion. It did not perceive that it also lay in that hand which had removed Napoleon. It thought that it had roots because it was the past. It was mistaken. It formed a part of the past, but the whole past was France. The roots of French society were not fixed in the Bourbons, but in the nation. These obscure and lively roots constituted not the right of a family, but the history of a people. They were everywhere, except under the throne. The House of Bourbon was to France the illustrious and bleeding knot in her history, but was no longer the principal element of her destiny and the necessary base of her politics. She could get along without the Bourbons. She had done without them for 22 years. There had been a break of continuity. They did not suspect the fact. And how should they have suspected it, they who fancied that Louis XVII reigned on the 9th of Thermidor, and that Louis XVIII was reigning at the Battle of Marengo? Never, since the origin of history, had princes been so blind in the presence of facts and the portion of divine authority which facts contain and promulgate. Never had that pretension here below, which is called the right of kings, denied to such a point the right from on high. A capital error which led this family to lay its hand once more on the guarantees granted in 1814, on the concessions, as it termed them. Sad, a sad thing! What it had termed its concessions were our conquests. What it termed our encroachments were our rights. When the hour seemed to it to have come, the Restoration, supposing itself victorious over Bonaparte and well-rooted in the country, that is to say, believing itself to be strong and deep, abruptly decided on its plan of action and risked its stroke. One morning it drew itself up before the face of France, and elevating its voice, it contested the collective title and the individual right of the nation to sovereignty, of the citizen to liberty. In other words, it denied to the nation that which made it a nation, and to the citizen that which made him a citizen. This is the foundation of those famous acts which are called the Ordinances of July. The Restoration fell. It fell justly, but, we admit, it had not been absolutely hostile to all forms of progress. Great things had been accomplished with it alongside. Under the Restoration, the nation had grown accustomed to calm discussion, which had been lacking under the Republic, and to grandeur and peace, which had been wanting under the Empire. France, free and strong, had offered an encouraging spectacle to the other peoples of Europe. The Revolution had had the word under Robespierre, the cannon had had the word under Bonaparte. It was under Louis XVIII and Charles X that it was the turn of intelligence to have the word. The wind ceased, and the torch was lighted once more. On the lofty heights the pure light of mind could be seen flickering. A magnificent, useful, and charming spectacle. For a space of 15 years, those great principles, which are so old for the thinker, so new for the statesman, could be seen at work in perfect peace on the public square. Equality before the law, liberty of conscience, liberty of speech, liberty of the press, the accessibility of all aptitudes to all functions. Thus it proceeded until 1830. The Bourbons were an instrument of civilization which broke in the hands of Providence. The fall of the Bourbons was full of grandeur, not on their side, but on the side of the nation. They quitted the throne with gravity, but without authority. Their descent into the night was not one of those solemn disappearances which leave a sombre emotion in history. It was neither the spectral calm of Charles I nor the eagle scream of Napoleon. They departed, that is all. They laid down the crown and retained no aureole. They were worthy, but they were not august. They lacked, in a certain measure, the majesty of their misfortune. Charles X, during the voyage from Cherbourg, causing a round table to be cut over into a square table, appeared to be more anxious about imperiled etiquette than about the crumbling monarchy. This diminution saddened devoted men who loved their persons, and serious men who honored their race. The populace was admirable. The nation, attacked one morning with weapons by a sort of royal insurrection, felt itself in the possession of so much force that it did not go into a raid. It defended itself, restrained itself, restored things to their places, the government to law, the Bourbons to exile, alas, and then halted. It took the old King Charles X from beneath that dais which had sheltered Louis XIV and set him gently on the ground. It touched the royal personages only with sadness and precaution. It was not one man, it was not a few men, it was France, France entire, France victorious and intoxicated with her victory, who seemed to be coming to herself, and who put into practice, before the eyes of the whole world, the grave words of Guillaume Duvert after the day of the Barricades. It is easy, for those who are accustomed, to skim the favors of the great, and to spring like a bird from bough to bough, from an afflicted fortune to a flourishing one, to show themselves harsh towards their prince in his adversity, But as for me, the fortune of my kings, and especially of my afflicted kings, will always be venerable to me. The Bourbons carried away with them respect, but not regret. As we have just stated, their misfortune was greater than they were. They faded out in the horizon. The Revolution of July instantly had friends and enemies throughout the entire world. The first rushed towards her with joy and enthusiasm, the others turned away, each according to his nature. At the first blush, the princes of Europe, the owls of this dawn, shut their eyes, wounded and stupefied, and only opened them to threaten. A fright which can be comprehended, a wrath which can be pardoned. This strange revolution had hardly produced a shock. It had not even paid to vanquished royalty the honor of treating it as an enemy and of shedding its blood. In the eyes of despotic governments, who are always interested in having liberty calumniate itself, the Revolution of July committed the fault of being formidable and of remaining gentle. Nothing, however, was attempted or plotted against it. The most discontented, the most irritated, the most trembling saluted it. Whatever our egotism and our rancor may be, a mysterious respect springs from events in which we are sensible of the collaboration of someone who is working above man. The Revolution of July is the triumph of right overthrowing the fact, a thing which is full of splendor. Right overthrowing the fact, hence the brilliancy of the Revolution of 1830, hence also its mildness. Right triumphant has no need of being violent. Right is the just and the true. The property of right is to remain eternally beautiful and pure. The fact, even when most necessary to all appearances, even when most thoroughly accepted by contemporaries, if it exist only as a fact, and if it contain only too little of right or none at all, is infallibly destined to become, in the course of time, deformed, impure, perhaps even monstrous. If one desires to learn at one blow to what degree of hideousness the fact can attain, viewed at the distance of centuries, let him look at Machiavelli. Machiavelli is not an evil genius, nor a demon, nor a miserable and cowardly writer. He is nothing but the fact. And he is not only the Italian fact, he is the European fact, the fact of the 16th century. He seems hideous, and so he is, in the presence of the moral idea of the 19th. This conflict of right and fact has been going on ever since the origin of society. To terminate this duel, to amalgamate the pure idea with the humane reality, to cause right to penetrate pacifically into the fact, and the fact into the right, that is the task of sages. End of Book 1, Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Book 1 of Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 1, A Few Pages of History. Chapter 2, Badly Sewed. But the task of sages is one thing, the task of clever men is another. The Revolution of 1830 came to a sudden halt. As soon as a revolution has made the coast, the skilful make haste to prepare the shipwreck. The skilful in our century have conferred on themselves the title of statesmen, so that this word, statesman, has ended by becoming somewhat of a slang word. It must be borne in mind, in fact, that wherever there is nothing but skill, there is necessarily pettiness. To say the skilful amounts to saying the mediocre. In the same way, to say statesmen is sometimes equivalent to saying traitors. If, then, we are to believe the skilful, revolutions like the Revolution of July are severed arteries, a prompt ligature is indispensable. The right, too grandly proclaimed, is shaken. Also, right once firmly fixed, the state must be strengthened. Liberty once assured, attention must be directed to power. Here the sages are not, as yet, separated from the skilful, but they begin to be distrustful. Power, very good, but in the first place, what is power? In the second, whence comes it? The skilful do not seem to hear the murmured objection, and they continue their maneuvers. According to the politicians, who are ingenious in putting the mask of necessity on profitable fiction, the first requirement of a people after a revolution, when this people forms part of a monarchical continent, is to procure for itself a dynasty. In this way, they say, peace, that is to say, time to dress our wounds and to repair the house, can be had after a revolution. The dynasty conceals the scaffolding and covers the ambulance. Now, it is not always easy to procure a dynasty. If it is absolutely necessary, the first man of genius or even the first man of fortune who comes to hand suffices for the manufacturing of a king. You have, in the first place, Napoleon, in the second, Iturbide. But the first family that comes to hand does not suffice to make a dynasty. There is necessarily required a certain modicum of antiquity in a race, and the wrinkle of the centuries cannot be improvised. If we place ourselves at the point of view of the statesman, after making all allowances, of course, after a revolution, what are the qualities of a king which result from it? He may be, and it is useful for him to be, a revolutionary, that is to say, a participant in his own person in that revolution, that he should have lent a hand to it, that he should have either compromised or distinguished himself therein, that he should have touched the axe or wielded the sword in it. What are the qualities of a dynasty? It should be national, that is to say, revolutionary at a distance, not through acts committed, but by reason of ideas accepted. It should be composed of past and be historic, be composed of future and be sympathetic. All this explains why the early revolutions contented themselves with finding a man, Cromwell or Napoleon, and why the second absolutely insisted on finding a family, the House of Brunswick or the House of Orleans. Royal houses resemble those Indian fig trees, each branch of which, bending over to the earth, takes root and becomes a fig tree itself. Each branch may become a dynasty, on the sole condition that it shall bend down to the people. Such is the theory of the skilful. Here, then, lies the great art, to make a little render to success the sound of a catastrophe, in order that those who profit by it may tremble from it also, to season with fear every step that is taken, to augment the curve of the transition to the point of retarding progress, to dull that aurora, to denounce and retrench the harshness of enthusiasm, to cut all angles and nails, to wad triumph, to muffle up right, to envelope the giant people in flannel and to put it to bed very speedily, to impose a diet on that excess of health, to put Hercules on the treatment of a convalescent, to dilute the event with the expedient, to offer to spirits thirsting for the ideal that nectar thinned out with a potion, to take one's precaution against too much success, to garnish the revolution with a shade. 1830 practiced this theory, already applied to England by 1688. 1830 is a revolution arrested midway, half of progress, quasi-right. Now logic knows not the almost, absolutely as the sun knows not the candle. Who arrests revolutions halfway? The bourgeoisie. Why? Because the bourgeoisie is interest which has reached satisfaction. Yesterday it was appetite, today it is plenitude, tomorrow it will be satiety. The phenomenon of 1814 after Napoleon was reproduced in 1830 after Charles X. The attempt has been made, and wrongly, to make a class of the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie is simply the contented portion of the people. The bourgeois is the man who now has time to sit down. A chair is not a caste. But through a desire to sit down too soon, one may arrest the very march of the human race. This has often been the fault of the bourgeoisie. One is not a class because one has committed a fault. Selfishness is not one of the divisions of the social order. Moreover, we must be just to selfishness. The state to which that part of the nation which is called the bourgeoisie aspired after the shock of 1830 was not the inertia which is complicated with indifference and laziness, and which contains a little shame. It was not the slumber which presupposes a momentary forgetfulness accessible to dreams. It was the halt. The halt is a word formed of a singular, double, and almost contradictory sense. A troop on the march, that is to say movement. A stand, that is to say repose. The halt is the restoration of forces. It is repose armed and on the alert. It is the accomplished fact which posts sentinels and holds itself on its guard. The halt presupposes the combat of yesterday and the combat of tomorrow. It is the partition between 1830 and 1848. What we here call combat may also be designated as progress. The bourgeoisie, then, as well as the statesman, required a man who should express this word halt, and although because, a composite individuality, signifying revolution and signifying stability, in other terms strengthening the present by the evident compatibility of the past with the future. This man was already found. His name was Louis Philippe d'Orléans. The 221 made Louis Philippe king. Lafayette undertook the coronation. He called it the best of republics. The town hall of Paris took the place of the cathedral of Rheims. This substitution of a half-throne for a whole throne was the work of 1830. When the skilful had finished, the immense vice of their solution became apparent. All this had been accomplished outside the bounds of absolute right. Absolute right cried, "I protest!" Then, terrible to say, it retired into the darkness. End of Book 1, Chapter 2.
Chapter 3 of Book 1 of Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 1. A Few Pages of History. Chapter 3. Louis Philippe. Revolutions have a terrible arm and a happy hand. They strike firmly and choose well. Even incomplete, even debased and abused, and reduced to their state of a junior revolution, like the Revolution of 1830, they nearly always retain sufficient providential lucidity to prevent them from falling amiss. Their eclipse is never an abdication. Nevertheless, let us not boast too loudly. Revolutions also may be deceived, and grave errors have been seen. Let us return to 1830. 1830, in its deviation, had good luck. In the establishment which entitled itself order after the Revolution had been cut short, the king amounted to more than royalty. Louis Philippe was a rare man. The son of a father to whom history will accord certain attenuating circumstances, but also as worthy of esteem as that father had been of blame. Possessing all private virtues and many public virtues, careful of his health, of his fortune, of his person, of his affairs, knowing the value of a minute and not always the value of a year. Sober, serene, peaceable, patient, a good man and a good prince, sleeping with his wife, and having in his palace lackeys charged with the duty of showing the conjugal bed to the bourgeois, an ostentation of the regular sleeping apartment which had become useful after the former illegitimate displays of the elder branch. Knowing all the languages of Europe, and, what is more rare, all the languages of all interests, and speaking them. An admirable representative of the middle class, but outstripping it, and in every way greater than it. Possessing excellent sense, well appreciating the blood from which he had sprung. Counting most of all on his intrinsic worth, and on the question of his race very particular, declaring himself Orleans and not Bourbon. Thoroughly the first prince of the blood royal, while he was still only a serene highness, but a frank bourgeois from the day he became king. Diffuse in public, concise in private, reputed but not proved to be a miser. At bottom, one of those economists who are readily prodigal at their own fancy or duty. Lettered, but not very sensitive to letters. A gentleman, but not a chevalier. Simple, calm, and strong, adored by his family and his household. A fascinating talker, an undeceived statesman, inwardly cold, dominated by immediate interest, always governing at the shortest range, incapable of rancor and gratitude, making use without mercy of superiority on mediocrity. Clever in getting parliamentary majorities to put in the wrong those mysterious unanimities which mattered duly under thrones. Unreserved, sometimes imprudent in his lack of reserve, but with marvellous address in that imprudence. Fertile in expedients, in countenances, in masks. Making France fear Europe, and Europe France. Incontestably fond of his country, but preferring his family. Assuming more domination than authority, and more authority than dignity, a disposition which has this unfortunate property, that, as it turns everything into success, it admits of ruse and does not absolutely repudiate baseness, but which has this valuable side, that it preserves politics from violent shocks, the state from fractures, and society from catastrophes. Minute, correct, vigilant, attentive, sagacious, indefatigable, contradicting himself at times and giving himself the lie. Bold against Austria and Ancona, obstinate against England in Spain, bombarding Antwerp and paying off Pritchard, signing the Marseillais with conviction, inaccessible to despondency, to lassitude, to the taste for the beautiful and the ideal, to daring generosity, to utopia, to chimeras, to wrath, to vanity, to fear, possessing all the forms of personal intrepidity, a general at Valmy, a soldier at Jamesallen, attacked 8 times by regicide, and always smiling, brave as a grenadier, courageous as a thinker, uneasy only in the face of the chances of a European shaking up, and unfitted for great political adventures, always ready to risk his life, never his work, distinguishing his will and influence in order that he might be obeyed as an intelligence rather than as a king, endowed with observation and not with divination, not very attentive to minds, but knowing men, that is to say, requiring to see in order to judge, prompt and penetrating good sense, practical wisdom, easy speech, prodigious memory, drawing incessantly on this memory, his only point of resemblance with Caesar, Alexander, and Napoleon, knowing deeds, facts, details, dates, proper names, ignorant of tendencies, passions, the diverse geniuses of the crowd, the interior aspirations, the hidden and obscure uprisings of souls, in a word, all that can be designated as the invisible currents of consciences, accepted by the surface, but little in accord with France lower down, extricating himself by dint of tact, governing too much and not enough, his own first minister, excellent at creating out of the pettiness of realities an obstacle to the immensity of ideas, mingling a genuine creative faculty of civilization, of order and organization, an indescribable spirit of proceedings and chicanery, the founder and lawyer of a dynasty, having something of Charlemagne and something of an attorney, in short, a lofty and original figure, a prince who understood how to create authority in spite of the uneasiness of France, and power in spite of the jealousy of Europe. Louis Philippe will be classed among the eminent men of his century, and would be ranked among the most illustrious governors of history, had he loved glory but a little, and if he had had the sentiment of what is great to the same degree as the feeling for what is useful. Louis Philippe had been handsome, and in his old age he remained graceful. Not always approved by the nation, he always was so by the masses. He pleased. He had that gift of charming. He lacked majesty. He wore no crown, although a king, and no white hair, although an old man. His manners belonged to the old regime, and his habits to the new, a mixture of the noble and the bourgeois which suited 1830. Louis Philippe was transition reigning. He had preserved the ancient pronunciation and the ancient orthography which he placed at the service of opinions modern. He loved Poland and Hungary, but he wrote les Polonais, and he pronounced les Hongrais. He wore the uniform of the National Guard, like Charles X, and the ribbon of the Legion of Honor, like Napoleon. He went a little to chapel, not at all to the chase, never to the opera, incorruptible by sacristans, by worshippers in, by ballet dancers. This made a part of his bourgeois popularity. He had no heart. He went out with his umbrella under his arm, and this umbrella long formed a part of his aureole. He was a bit of a mason, a bit of a gardener, something of a doctor. He bled a postilion who had tumbled from his horse. Louis Philippe no more went about without his lancet than did Henry IV without his poniard. The royalists jeered at this ridiculous king, the first who had ever shed blood without the object of healing. For the grievances against Louis Philippe, there is one deduction to be made. There is that which accuses the royalty, that which accuses the reign, that which accuses the king. 3 columns which all give different totals. Democratic right confiscated, progress becomes a matter of secondary interest. The protests of the street violently repressed. Military execution of insurrections. The rising passed over by arms. The Rue Transonienne the councils of war, the absorption of the real country by the legal country on half-shares with 300,000 privileged persons. These are the deeds of royalty. Belgium refused, Algeria too harshly conquered, and, as in the case of India, by the English, with more barbarism than civilization. The breach of faith to Abd el-Kader, Blaye, Deutsch bought, Pritchard paid. These are the doings of the reign. The policy which was more domestic than national was the doing of the king. As will be seen, the proper deduction having been made, the king's charge is decreased. This is his great fault. He was modest in the name of France. Whence arises this fault? We will state it. Louis Philippe was rather too much of a paternal king. That incubation of a family with the objection of founding a dynasty is afraid of everything and does not like to be disturbed. Hence excessive timidity, which is displeasing to the people, who have the 14th of July in their civil and Austerlitz in their military traditions. Moreover, if we deduct the public duties which require to be fulfilled first of all, that deep tenderness of Louis Philippe towards his family was deserved by the family. That domestic group was worthy of admiration. Virtues there dwelt side by side with talents. One of Louis Philippe's daughters, Marie d'Orléans, placed the name of her race among artists, as Charles d'Orléans had placed it among poets. She made of her soul a marble which she named Jeanne d'Arc. Two of Louis Philippe's daughters elicited from Metternich this eulogium. They are young people such as are rarely seen, and princes such as are never seen. This without any dissimulation, and also without any exaggeration, is the truth about Louis Philippe. To be prince equality, to bear in his own person the contradiction of the Restoration and the Revolution, to have that disquieting side of the revolutionary which becomes reassuring in governing power, therein lay the fortune of Louis Philippe in 1830. Never was there a more complete adaptation of a man to an event. The one entered into the other, and the incarnation took place. Louis Philippe is 1830 made man. Moreover, he had in his favor that great recommendation to the throne, exile. He had been proscribed, a wanderer, poor. He had lived by his own labor. In Switzerland, this heir to the richest princely domains in France had sold an old horse in order to obtain bread. At Reichenau, he gave lessons in mathematics, while his sister Adelaide did wool work and sewed. These souvenirs connected with a king rendered the bourgeoisie enthusiastic. He had with his own hands demolished the iron cage of Mont Saint-Michel, built by Louis XI and used by Louis XV. He was the companion of Dumouriez. He was the friend of Lafayette. He had belonged to the Jacobins' Club. Marabout had slapped him on the shoulder. Danton had said to him, "Young man." At the age of 24, in '93, being then Monsieur de Chartres, he had witnessed from the depth of a box the trial of Louis XVI, so well named, that poor tyrant. The blind clairvoyance of the Revolution, breaking royalty in the king and the king with royalty, did so almost without noticing the man in the fierce crushing of the idea, the vast storm of the Assembly tribunal, the public wrath interrogating Carpe, not knowing what to reply, the alarming stupefied vacillation by the royal head beneath that sombre breath, the relative innocence of all in that catastrophe of those who condemned as well as of the man condemned. He had looked on those things. He had contemplated that giddiness. He had seen the centuries appear before the bar of the Assembly Convention. He had beheld behind Louis XVI that unfortunate passer-by who was made responsible, the terrible culprit, the monarchy, rise through the shadows, and there had lingered in his soul the respectful fear of these immense justices of the populace, which are almost as impersonal as the justice of God. The trace left in him by the Revolution was prodigious. Its memory was like a living imprint of those great years, minute by minute. One day, in the presence of a witness whom we are not permitted to doubt, he rectified from memory the whole of the letter A in the alphabetical list of the Constituent Assembly. Louis Philippe was a king of the broad daylight. While he reigned, the press was free, the tribune was free, conscience and speech were free. The laws of September are open to sight. Although fully aware of the gnawing power of light on privileges, he left his throne exposed to the light. History will do justice to him for this loyalty. Louis Philippe, like all historical men who have passed from the scene, is today put on trial by the human conscience. His case is as yet only in the lower court. The hour when history speaks with its free and venerable accent has not yet sounded for him. The moment has not come to pronounce a definite judgment on this king. The austere and illustrious historian, Louis Blanc, has himself recently softened his first verdict. Louis Philippe was elected by those two almosts which are called the 221 and 1830, that is to say, by a half parliament and a half revolution. And in any case, from the superior point of view where philosophy must place itself, we cannot judge him here, as the reader has seen above, except with certain reservations in the name of the absolute democratic principle. In the eyes of the absolute, outside these two rights, the right of man in the first place, and the right of the people in the second, all is usurpation. But what we can say, even at the present day, that after making these reserves, is, that to sum up the whole, and in whatever manner he is considered, Louis Philippe, taken in himself, and from the point of view of human goodness, will remain, to use the antique language of ancient history, one of the best princes who ever sat on a throne. What is there against him? That throne. Take away Louis Philippe the king, there remains the man, and the man is good. He is good at times, even to the point of being admirable. Often, in the midst of his greatest souvenirs, after a day of conflict with the whole diplomacy of the continent, he returned at night to his apartments, and there, exhausted with fatigue, overwhelmed with sleep, what did he do? He took a death sentence and passed the night in revising a criminal suit, considering it something to hold his own against Europe, but that it was a still greater matter to rescue a man from the executioner. He obstinately maintained his opinion against his keeper of the seals. He disputed the ground with the guillotine foot by foot against the crown attorneys, those chatterers of the law, as he called them. Sometimes the pile of sentences covered his table. He examined them all. It was anguish to him to abandon these miserable, condemned heads. One day he said to the same witness to whom we have recently referred, "I won 7 last night." During the early years of his reign, the death penalty was as good as abolished, and the erection of a scaffold was a violence committed against the king. The Greve having disappeared with the elder branch, a bourgeois place of execution was instituted under the name of the Barrière Saint-Jacques. Practical men felt the necessity of a quasi-legitimate guillotine, and this was one of the victories of Casimir Perier, who represented the narrow sides of the bourgeoisie, over Louis Philippe, who represented its liberal sides. Louis Philippe annotated Beccaria with his own hand. After the Fasci machine, he exclaimed, "What a pity that I was not wounded! Then I might have pardoned." On another occasion, alluding to the resistance offered by his ministry, he wrote in connection with a political criminal, who is one of the most generous figures of our day, "His pardon is granted. It only remains for me to obtain it." Louis Philippe was as gentle as Louis IX, and as kindly as Henry IV. Now, to our mind in history, where kindness is the rarest of pearls, the man who is kindly almost takes precedence of the man who is great. Louis Philippe, having been severely judged by some, harshly perhaps by others, it is quite natural that a man, himself a phantom at the present day, who knew that king, should come and testify in his favor before history. This deposition, whatever else it may be, is evidently, and above all things, entirely disinterested. An epitaph penned by a dead man is sincere. One shade may console another shade. The sharing of the same shadows confers the right to praise it. It is not greatly to be feared that it will ever be said of two tombs in exile, this one flattered the other. End of Book 1, Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Book 1 of Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 1. A few pages of history. Chapter 4. Cracks beneath the foundation. At the moment when the drama which we are narrating is on the point of penetrating into the depths of one of the tragic clouds which enveloped the beginning of Louis Philippe's reign, it was necessary that there should be no equivoque, and it became requisite that this book should offer some explanation with regard to this king. Louis Philippe had entered into possession of his royal authority without violence, without any direct action on his part, by virtue of a revolutionary change, evidently quite distinct from the real aim of the evolution, but in which he, the Duc d'Orléans, exercised no personal initiative. He had been born a prince, and he believed himself to have been elected king. He had not served this mandate on himself. He had not taken it. It had been offered to him, and he had accepted it. Convinced wrongly, to be sure, but convinced nevertheless that the offer was in accordance with right, and that the acceptance of it was in accordance with duty. Hence his possession was in good faith. Now, we say it in good conscience, Louis Philippe being in possession in perfect good faith, and the democracy being in good faith in its attack, the amount of terror discharged by the social conflicts weighs neither on the king nor on the democracy. A clash of principles resembles a clash of elements. The ocean defends the water, the hurricane defends the air. The king defends royalty, the democracy defends the people. The relative, which is the monarchy, resists the absolute, which is the republic. Society bleeds in this conflict, but that which constitutes its suffering today will constitute its safety later on. And in any case, those who combat are not to be blamed. One of the two parties is evidently mistaken. The right is not, like the Colossus of Rhodes, on two shores at once, with one foot on the republic and one in the royalty. It is indivisible, and all on one side, but those who are in error are so sincerely. A blind man is no more a criminal than a Vendean is a ruffian. Let us then impute to the fatality of things alone these formidable collusions. Whatever the nature of these tempests may be, human irresponsibility is mingled with them. Let us complete this exposition. The government of 1840 led a hard life immediately. Born yesterday, it was obliged to fight today. Hardly installed, it was already everywhere conscious of vague movements of traction on the apparatus of July so recently laid, and so lacking in solidity. Resistance was born on the morrow. Perhaps even it was born on the preceding evening. From month to month the hostility increased, and from being concealed it became patent. The Revolution of July, which gained but little acceptance outside of France by kings, had been diversely interpreted in France, as we have said. God delivers over to men his visible will in events, an obscure text written in a mysterious tongue. Men immediately make translations of it, translations hasty, incorrect, full of errors, of gaps, and of nonsense. Very few minds comprehend the divine language. The most sagacious, the calmest, the most profound decipher slowly, and when they arrive with their text, the task has long been completed. There are already 20 translations on the public place. From each remaining springs a party, and from each misinterpretation a faction, and each party thinks that it alone has the true text, and each faction that it possesses the light. Power itself is often a faction. There are, in revolutions, swimmers who go against the current. They are the old parties. For the old parties, who clung to heredity by the grace of God, think that revolutions having sprung from the right to revolt, one has the right to revolt against them. Error. For in these revolutions, the one who revolts is not the people, it is the king. Revolution is precisely contrary of revolt. Every revolution, being a normal outcome, contains within itself its legitimacy, which false revolutionists sometimes dishonor, but which remains even when soiled, which survives even when stained with blood. Revolutions spring not from an accident, but from necessity. A revolution is a return from the fictitious to the real. It is because it must be that it is. None the less did the old legitimist parties assail the Revolution of 1830 with all the vehemence which arises from false reasoning. Errors make excellent projectiles. They strike it cleverly in its vulnerable spot, in default of a cuirass, in its lack of logic. They attacked this revolution in its royalty. They shouted to it, "Revolution, why this king?" Factions are blind men who aim correctly. This cry was uttered equally by the Republicans, but coming from them, this cry was logical. What was blindness in the Legitimists was clearness of vision in the Democrats. 1830 had bankrupted the people. The enraged democracy reproached it with this. Between the attack of the past and the attack of the future, the establishment of July struggled. It represented the minute at loggerheads on the one hand, with the monarchical centuries on the other hand, with eternal right. In addition, and besides all this, it was no longer revolution and had become a monarchy. 1830 was obliged to take precedence of all Europe. To keep the peace was an increase of complication. A harmony established contrary to sense is often more onerous than a war. From this secret conflict, always muzzled but always growing, was born armed peace, that ruinous expedient of civilization which in the harness of the European cabinets is suspicious in itself. The royalty of July reared up, in spite of the fact that it caught it in the harness of European cabinets. Metternich would gladly have put it in kicking straps. Pushed on in France by progress, it pushed on the monarchies, those loiterers in Europe. After having been towed, it undertook to tow. Meanwhile, within her, pauperism, the proletariat, salary, education, penal servitude, prostitution, the fate of the woman, wealth, misery, production, consumption, division, exchange, coin, credit, the rights of capital, the rights of labor, all these questions were multiplied above society, a terrible slope. Outside of political parties properly so called, another movement became manifest. Philosophical fermentation replied to democratic fermentation. The elect felt troubled as well as the masses, in another manner, but quite as much. Thinkers meditated, while the soil, that is to say the people, traversed by revolutionary currents, trembled under them with indescribably vague epileptic shocks. These dreamers, some isolated, others united in families and almost in communion, turned over social questions in a pacific but profound manner. Impassive miners who tranquilly pushed their galleries into the depths of a volcano, hardly disturbed by the dull commotion and the furnaces of which they caught glimpses. This tranquillity was not the least beautiful spectacle of this agitated epoch. These men left to political parties the question of rights. They occupied themselves with the question of happiness. The well-being of man, that was what they wanted to extract from society. They raised material questions, questions of agriculture, of industry, of commerce, almost to the dignity of a religion. In civilization, such as it has formed itself a little by the command of God, a great deal by the agency of man, interests combine, unite, and amalgamate in a manner to form a veritable hard rock, in accordance with a dynamic law. patiently studied by economists, those geologists of politics. These men who group themselves under different appellations, but who may all be designated by the generic title of socialists, endeavor to pierce that rock, and to cause it to spout forth the living waters of human felicity. From the question of the scaffold to the question of war, their works embraced everything. To the rights of man, as proclaimed by the Revolution, they added the rights of woman and the rights of the child. The reader will not be surprised if, for various reasons, we do not here treat in a thorough manner, from the theoretical point of view, the questions raised by socialism. We confine ourselves to indicating them. All the problems that the socialists propose to themselves, cosmogonic visions, reverie, and mysticism being cast aside, can be reduced to two principal problems. First problem, to produce wealth. Second problem, to share it. The first problem contains the question of work. The second contains the question of salary. In the first problem, the employment of forces is in question. In the second, the distribution of enjoyment. From the proper employment of forces results public power. From a good distribution of enjoyments results individual happiness. By a good distribution, not an equal, but an equitable distribution must be understood. From these two things combined, the public power without, individual happiness within, results social prosperity. Social prosperity means the man happy, the citizen free, the nation great. England solves the first of these two problems. She creates wealth admirably. She divides it badly. This solution, which is complete on one side only, leads her fatally to two extremes: monstrous opulence, monstrous wretchedness. All enjoyments for some, all privations for the rest, that is to say, for the people. Privilege, exception, monopoly, feudalism, born from toil itself. A false and dangerous situation, which sates public power or private misery, which sets the roots of the state in the sufferings of the individual. A badly constituted grandeur, in which are combined all the material elements, and into which no moral element enters. Communism and agrarian law think that they solve the second problem. They are mistaken. Their division kills production. Equal partition abolishes emulation, and consequently labor. It is a partition made by the butcher, which kills that which it divides. It is therefore impossible to pause over these pretended solutions. Slaying wealth is not the same thing as dividing it. The two problems require to be solved together to be well solved. The two problems must be combined and made but one. Solve only the first of the two problems, you will be Venice, you will be England. You will have, like Venice, an artificial power, or, like England, a material power. You will be the wicked rich man. You will die by an act of violence, as Venice did, or by bankruptcy, as England will fall. And the world will allow to die and fall all that is merely selfishness, all that does not represent for the human race either a virtue or an idea. It is well understood here that by the words Venice and England we designate not the peoples but social structures. The oligarchies superposed on nations, and not the nations themselves. The nations always have our respect and our sympathy. Venice as a people will live again. England, the aristocracy, will fall, but England, the nation, is immortal. That said, we continue. Solve the two problems, encourage the wealthy, and protect the poor. Suppress misery. Put an end to the unjust farming out of the feeble by the strong. Put a bridle on the iniquitous jealousy of the man who is making his way against the man who has reached the goal. Adjust mathematically and fraternally salary to labor. Mingle gratuitous and compulsory education with the growth of childhood, and make of science the base of manliness. Develop minds while keeping arms busy. Be at one and the same time a powerful people and a family of happy men. Render poverty democratic, not by abolishing it, but by making it universal, so that every citizen without exception may be a proprietor. An easier matter than is generally supposed. In 2 words, learn how to produce wealth and how to distribute it, and you will have at once moral and material greatness, and you will be worthy to call yourself France. This is what socialism said outside and above a few sects which have gone astray. This is what it sought in facts. That is what it sketched out in minds. Efforts worthy of admiration, sacred attempts. These doctrines, these theories, these resistances, the unforeseen necessity for the statesman to take philosophers into account, confused evidences of which we catch a glimpse, a new system of politics to be created, which shall be in accord with the old world, without too much disaccord with the new revolutionary ideal. A situation in which it became necessary to use Lafayette to defend Polignac. The institution of progress transparent beneath the revolt, the chambers and streets, the competitions to be brought into equilibrium around him, his faith in the revolution, perhaps an eventual indefinable resignation born of the vague acceptance of a superior definitive right, his desire to remain of his race, his domestic spirit, his sincere respect for the people, his own honesty, preoccupied Louis-Philippe almost painfully, and there were moments when, strong and courageous as he was overwhelmed by the difficulties of being a king. He felt under his feet a formidable disaggregation, which was not, nevertheless, a reduction to dust, France being more France than ever. Piles of shadows covered the horizon. A strange shade, gradually drawing nearer, extended little by little over men, over things, over ideas, a shade which came from wraths and systems. Everything which had been hastily stifled was moving and fermenting. At times, the conscience of the honest man resumed its breathing, so great was the discomfort of the air in which sophisms were intermingled with truths. Spirits trembled in the social anxiety like leaves at the approach of a storm. The electric tension was such that at certain instants the first comer, a stranger, brought light. Then the twilight obscurity closed in again. At intervals, deep and dull mutterings allowed a judgment to be formed as to the quantity of thunder contained by the cloud. 20 months had barely elapsed since the Revolution of July. The year 1832 had opened with an aspect of something impending and threatening. The distress of the people, the laborers without bread, the last Prince de Conde engulfed in the shadows, Brussels expelling the Nassau as Paris did the Bourbons, Belgium offering herself to a French prince and giving herself to an English prince, the Russian hatred of Nicholas, behind us the demons of the south, Ferdinand in Spain, Miguel in Portugal, the earthquaking in Italy, Metternich extending his hand over Bologna, France treating Austria sharply at Ancona. At the north, no one knew what sinister sound of the hammer nailing up Poland in her coffin. Irritated glances watching France narrowly all over Europe. England, a suspected ally, ready to give a push to that which was tottering, and to hurl herself on to that which should fall. The peerage sheltering itself behind Beccaria, to refuse foreheads to the law. The fleur-de-lis erased from the king's carriage. The cross torn from Notre Dame. Lafayette lessened. Lafitte ruined. Benjamin Constant dead in indignance. Casimir Perier dead in the exhaustion of his power. Political and social malady breaking out simultaneously in the two capitals of the kingdom, the one in the city of thought, the other in the city of toil. At Paris, civil war. At Lyons, servile war. In the two cities, the same glare of the furnace, a crater-like crimson on the brow of the people. The south rendered fanatic, the west troubled. The Duchess de Berry in La Vendée. Plots, conspiracies, risings, cholera added the sombre roar of the tumult of events to the sombre roar of ideas. End of Book 1, Chapter 4.
Chapter 5 of Book 1 of Volume 4 of Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 1, A Few Pages of History. Chapter 5, Facts Whence History Springs and Which History Ignores. Towards the end of April, everything had become aggravated. The fermentation entered the boiling state. Ever since 1830, petty partial revolts had been going on here and there, which were quickly suppressed, but ever bursting forth afresh, the sign of a vast underlying conflagration. Something terrible was in preparation. Glimpses could be caught of the features, still indistinct and imperfectly lighted, of a possible revolution. France kept an eye on Paris. Paris kept an eye on the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. The Faubourg Saint-Antoine, which was in a dull glow, was beginning its ebullition. The wine shops of the Rue de Charonne were, although the union of the two epithets seems singular when applied to wine shops, grave and stormy. The government was there purely and simply called in question. There people publicly discussed the question of fighting or of keeping quiet. There were back shops where working men were made to swear that they would hasten into the street at the first cry of alarm, and that they would fight without counting the number of the enemy. This engagement once entered into, a man seated in the corner of the wine shop assumed a sonorous tone and said, "You understand, you have sworn." Sometimes they went upstairs to a private room on the first floor, and there scenes that were almost Masonic were enacted. They made the initiated take oaths to render service to himself, as well as to the fathers of families. That was the formula. In the tap rooms, subversive pamphlets were read. They treated the government with contempt, says a secret report of that time. Words like the following could be heard there: "I don't know the names of the leaders. We folks shall not know the day until 2 hours beforehand." One workman said, "There are 300 of us. Let each contribute 10 sous. That will make 150 francs, with which to procure powder and shot." Another said, "I don't ask for 6 months. I don't even ask for 2. In less than a fortnight we shall be paralleled with the government. With 25,000 men we can face them." Another said, "I don't sleep at night because I make cartridges all night." From time to time, men of bourgeois appearance and in good coats came and caused embarrassment, and with the air of command shook hands with the most important and then went away. They never stayed more than 10 minutes. Significant remarks were exchanged in a low tone. "The plot is ripe. The matter is arranged." "It was murmured by all who were there," to borrow the very expression of one of those who were present. The exaltation was such that one day a working man exclaimed before the whole wine shop, "We have no arms." One of his comrades replied, "The soldiers have," thus parodying, without being aware of the fact, Bonaparte's proclamation to the army in Italy. When they had anything of a more secret nature on hand, adds one report, they did not communicate it to each other. It is not easy to understand what they could conceal after what they said. These reunions were sometimes periodical. At certain ones of them there were never more than 8 or 10 persons present, and they were always the same. In others, anyone entered who wished, and the room was so full that they were forced to stand. Some went thither through enthusiasm and passion, others because it was on their way to their work. As during the Revolution, there were patriotic women in some of these wine shops who embraced newcomers. Other expressive facts came to light. A man would enter a shop, drink, and go his way with the remark, "Wine merchant, the Revolution will pay what is due to you." Revolutionary agents were appointed in a wine shop facing the Rue de Charonne. The balloting was carried on in their caps. Working men met at the houses of a fencing master who gave lessons in the Rue de Cotte. There was a trophy of arms formed of wooden broadswords, canes, clubs, and foils. One day the buttons were removed from the foils. A workman said, "There are 25 of us, but they don't count on me because I am looked upon as a machine." Later on, that machine became Quenisette. The indefinite things which were brewing gradually acquired a strange and indescribable notoriety. A woman, sweeping off her doorstep, said to another woman, "For a long time there has been a strong force busy making cartridges." In the open street, proclamation could be seen addressed to the National Guard in the departments. One of these proclamations was signed Berthaud, wine merchant. One day a man with his beard worn like a collar and with an Italian accent mounted a stone post at the door of the liquor cellar in the Marché Lenoir and read aloud a singular document which seemed to emanate from the occult power. Groups formed around him and applauded. The passages which touched the crowd most deeply were collected and noted down. "Our doctrines are trammeled, our proclamations torn, our bill stickers are spied upon and thrown into prison. The breakdown which has recently taken place in cottons has converted to us many mediums. The future of nations is being worked out in our obscure ranks. Here are the fixed terms: action or reaction, revolution or counter-revolution, for at our epoch we no longer believe either in inertia or in immobility. For the people against the people, that is the question. There is no other. On the day when we cease to suit you, break us, but up to that day help us to march on." All this in broad daylight. Other deeds, more audacious still, were suspicious in the eyes of the people by reason of their very audacity. On the 4th of April, 1832, a passer-by mounted the post on the corner which forms the angle of the Rue Saint-Marguerite and shouted, "I am a Babouvist." But beneath Babeuf, the people scented Gisquet. Among other things, this man said, "Down with property! The opposition of the left is cowardly and treacherous. When it wants to be on the right side, it preaches revolution. It is democratic in order to escape being beaten, and royalist so that it may not have to fight. The Republicans are beasts with feathers. Distrust the Republicans, citizens of the laboring classes." "Silence, citizen spy!" cried an artisan. This shout put an end to the discourse. Mysterious incidents occurred. At nightfall, a working man encountered near the canal a very well-dressed man who said to him, "Whither are you bound, citizen?" "Sir," replied the working man, "I have not the honor of your acquaintance." "I know you very well, however." And the man added, "Don't be alarmed. I am an agent of the committee. You are suspected of not being quite faithful. You know that if you reveal anything, there is an eye fixed on you." Then he shook hands with the working man and went away, saying, "We shall meet again soon." The police, who were on the alert, collected singular dialogues, not only in the wine shops, but in the street. "Get yourself received very soon," said a weaver to a cabinet maker. "Why?" "There is going to be a shot to fire." Two ragged pedestrians exchanged these remarkable replies, fraught with evident jacquerie. "Who governs us?" "Monsieur Philippe." "No, it is the bourgeoisie." The reader is mistaken if he thinks that we take the word jacquerie in a bad sense. The jacquets were the poor. On another occasion, two men were heard to say to each other as they passed by, "We have a good plan of attack." Only the following was caught of a private conversation between four men who were crouching in a ditch of the circle of the Barrière de Trône. "Everything possible will be done to prevent his walking about Paris any more." Who was the he? Menacing obscurity. The principal leaders, as they said in the faubourg, held themselves apart. It was supposed that they met for consultation in a wine shop near the Point Saint-Eustache. A certain Ogg, chief of the Society Aide for Tailors, Rue Mondétour, had the reputation of serving as intermediary central between the leaders and the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. Nevertheless, there was always a great deal of mystery about these leaders, and no certain fact can invalidate the singular arrogance of this reply made later on by a man accused before the Court of Peers. "Who was your leader?" "I knew of none, and I recognized none." There was nothing but words, transparent but vague, sometimes idle reports, rumors, hearsay. Other indications cropped up. A carpenter, occupied in nailing boards to a fence around the ground on which a house was in process of construction in the Rue de Rueil, found on that plot the torn fragment of a letter on which were still legible the following lines: "The committee must take measures to prevent recruiting in the sections for the different societies." And as a postscript, "We have learned that there are guns in the Rue de Faubourg Poissonnier, numero 5, to the number of 5 or 6,000 in the house of a gunsmith in that court. The section owns no arms." What excited the carpenter and caused him to show this thing to his neighbors was the fact that a few paces further on he picked up another paper, torn like the first, and still more significant, of which we reproduce a facsimile because of the historical interest attached to these strange documents. The document is in the form of a table, headed with the letters Q, C, D, E, followed by the instructions, "Learn this list by heart. After so doing, you will tear it up. The men admitted will do the same when you have transmitted their orders to them. Health and fraternity. U, O, G, A, F, E, L." It was only later on that the persons who were in the secret of this find at the time learned the significance of those 4 capital letters: quinturions, centurions, decurions, éclaireurs, scouts, and the sense of the letters U, O, G, A, F, E, which was a date and meant April 15th, 1832. Under each capital letter were inscribed names, followed by very characteristic notes. Thus, Q, Bannerel, 8 guns, 83 cartridges, a safe man. C, Boubier, 1 pistol, 40 cartridges. D, Rollet, 1 foil, 1 pistol, 1 pound of powder. E, Tessier, 1 sword, 1 cartridge box. Exact, Terrier, 8 guns, Brave, etc. Finally, this carpenter found, still in the same enclosure, a third paper, on which was written in pencil, but very legibly, this sort of enigmatical list: Unit, Blanchard, Arbre, Sec, 6, Barras, Soise, Salle au Comte, Kosciuszko, Aubry the butcher, J, R, Caius Gracius, right of revision, Dufond, 4, fall of the Girondist, Debrac, Maubuy, Washington, Pinson, 1 pistol, 86 cartridges, Marseillaise, sovereignty of the people, Michel, Quincampoix, sword, Hoche, Marceau, Plato, Arbre Sec, Warsaw, Tilly, crier of the Populaire. The honest bourgeois into whose hands this list fell knew its significance. It appears that this list was the complete nomenclature of the sections of the 4th arrondissement of the Society of the Rights of Man, with the names and dwellings of the chiefs of sections. Today, when all these facts which were obscure are nothing more than history, we may publish them. It should be added that the foundation of the Society of the Rights of Man seems to have been posterior to the date when this paper was found. Perhaps this was only a rough draft. Still, according to all the remarks and the words, according to written notes, material facts begin to make their appearance. In the Rue Popincourt, in the house of a dealer in bric-a-brac. There were seized 7 sheets of grey paper, all folded alike lengthwise and in 4. These sheets enclosed 26 squares of the same grey paper folded in the form of a cartridge and a card on which was written the following: saltpetre 12 ounces, sulphur 2 ounces, charcoal 2 ounces and a half, water 2 ounces. The report of the seizure stated that the drawer exhaled a strong smell of powder. A mason returning from his day's work left behind him a little package on a bench near the bridge at Austerlitz. This package was taken to the police station. It was opened, and in it were found 2 printed dialogues, signed L'Hotier, a song entitled Workmen Band Together, and a tin box full of cartridges. One artisan drinking with a comrade made the latter feel him to see how warm he was. The other man felt a pistol under his waistcoat. In a ditch on the boulevard between Père-Lachaise and the Barrière de Tronne, at the most deserted spot, some children, while playing, discovered beneath a mass of shavings and refuse bits of wood a bag containing a bullet mold, a wooden punch for the preparation of cartridges, a wooden bowl in which there were grains of hunting powder, and a little cast-iron pot whose interior presented evident traces of melted lead. Police agents, making their way suddenly and unexpectedly at 5 o'clock in the morning into the dwelling of a certain Pardon, who was afterwards a member of the Barricades Marie section and got himself killed in the insurrection of April 1834, found him standing near his bed and holding in his hand some cartridges, which he was in the act of preparing. Towards the hour when working men repose, 2 men were seen to meet between the Barrière Picpus and the Barrière Charenton in a little lane between 2 walls, near a wine shop, in front of which there was a jeu de Siam. One drew a pistol from beneath his blouse and handed it to the other. As he was handing it to him, he noticed that the perspiration of his chest had made the powder damp. He primed the pistol and added more powder to what was already in the pan. Then the 2 men parted. A certain Gallet, afterwards killed in the Rue Beaubourg in the affair of April, boasted of having in his house 700 cartridges and 24 flints. The government one day received a warning that arms and 200,000 cartridges had just been distributed in the faubourg. On the following week, 30,000 cartridges were distributed. The remarkable point about it was that the police were not able to seize a single one. An intercepted letter read, "The day is not far distant when, within 4 hours by the clock, 80,000 patriots will be under arms." All this fermentation was public, one might almost say tranquil. The approaching insurrection was preparing its storm calmly in the face of the government. No singularity was lacking to this still subterranean crisis, which was already perceptible. The bourgeoisie talked peacefully to the working classes of what was in preparation. They said, "How is the rising coming along?" in the same tone in which they would have said, "How is your wife?" A furniture dealer in the Rue Moreau inquired, "Well, when are you going to make the attack?" Another shopkeeper said, "The attack will be made soon. I know it. A month ago there were 15,000 of you, now there are 25,000. He offered his gun, and a neighbor offered a small pistol, which he was willing to sell for 7 francs. Moreover, the revolutionary fever was growing. Not a point in Paris nor in France was exempt from it. The artery was beating everywhere, like those membranes which arise from certain inflammations and form in the human body. The network of secret societies began to spread all over the country. From the associations of the Friends of the People, which was at the same time public and secret, sprang the Society of the Rights of Man, which also dated from one of the orders of the day, plunges, year 40 of the Republican era, which was destined to survive even the mandate of the Court of Assizes, which pronounced its dissolution and which did not hesitate to bestow on its sections significant names like the following: pikes, tocsin, signal cannon, Phrygian cap, January 21, the beggars, the vagabonds, forward march, Robespierre, level, ça ira. The Society of the Rights of Man engendered the Society of Action. These were impatient individuals who broke away and hastened ahead. Other associations sought to recruit themselves from the great mother societies. The members of sections complained that they were torn asunder. Thus the Gallic Society and the Committee of Organization of the Municipalities. Thus the associations for the liberty of the press, for individual liberty, for the instruction of the people against indirect taxes. Then the Society of Equal Working Men, which was divided into 3 fractions, the Levellers, the Communists, the Reformers. Then the Army of the Bastilles, a sort of cohort organized on a military footing, 4 men commanded by a corporal, 10 by a sergeant, 20 by a sub-lieutenant, 40 by a lieutenant. There were never more than 5 men who knew each other. Creation where precaution is combined with audacity, and which seems stamped with the genius of Venus. The Central Committee, which was at the head, had 2 arms, the Society of Action and the Army of the Bastille. A legitimist association, the Chevaliers of Fidelity, stirred about among these the Republican filiations. It was denounced and repudiated there. The Parisian societies had ramifications in the principal cities, Lyon, Nantes, Lille, Marseille, and each had its Society of the Rights of Man, the Charbonnières, and the Free Men. All had a revolutionary society which was called the Cougourde. We have already mentioned this word. In Paris, the Faubourg Saint-Marceau kept up an equal buzzing with the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, and the schools were no less moved than the faubourgs. A café in the Rue Saint-Hyacinthe and the wine shop of the 7 Billiards, Rue des Mathurins Saint-Jacques, served as rallying points for the students. The Society of the Friends of the ABC affiliated to the Mutualists of Angers and to the Cougourde of Aix met, as we have seen, in the Café Musain. These same young men assembled also, as we have stated already, in a restaurant wine shop of the Rue Mondétour, which was called Corinthe. These meetings were secret. Others were as public as possible, and the reader can judge of their boldness from these fragments of an interrogatory undergone in one of the ulterior prosecutions. Where was this meeting held? In the Rue de la Paix. At whose house? In the street. What sections were there? Only one. Which? The manual section. Who was its leader? I. But you are too young to have decided alone upon the bold course of attacking the government. Where did your instructions come from? From the Central Committee. The army was mined at the same time as the population, as was proved subsequently by the operations of Béford, Luneville, and Épinard. They counted on the 52nd Regiment, on the 5th, on the 8th, on the 37th, and on the 20th Light Cavalry. In Burgundy and in the southern towns they planted the Liberty Tree, that is to say, a pole surmounted by a red cap. Such was the situation. The Faubourg Saint-Antoine, more than any other group of the population, as we have stated in the beginning, accentuated this situation and made it felt. That was the sore point. This old faubourg, peopled like an ant-hill, laborious, courageous, and angry as a hive of bees, was quivering with expectation and with the desire for a tumult. Everything was in a state of agitation there, without any interruption, however, of the regular work. It is impossible to convey an idea of this lively yet sombre physiognomy. In this faubourg exists poignant distress hidden under attic roofs. There also exist rare and ardent minds. It is particularly in the matter of distress and intelligence that it is dangerous to have extremes meet. The Faubourg Saint-Antoine had also other causes to tremble, for it received the countershock of commercial crises, of failures, strikes, slack seasons, all inherent to great political disturbances. In times of revolution, misery is both cause and effect. The blow which it deals rebounds upon it. This population full of proud virtue, capable of the highest degree of latent heat, always ready to fly to arms, prompt to explode, irritated, deep, undermined, seemed to be only awaiting the fall of a spark. Whenever certain sparks float on the horizon chased by the wind of events, it is impossible not to think of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine and of the formidable chance which has placed at the very gates of Paris that powder-house of suffering and ideas. The wine shops of the Faubourg Antoine, which have been more than once drawn in the sketches which the reader has just perused, possess historical notoriety. In troublous times, people grow intoxicated there more on words than on wine. A sort of prophetic spirit and an afflatus of the future circulates there, swelling hearts and enlarging souls. The cabarets of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine resemble those taverns of Mont-Aventine, erected on the cave of the Sibyl, and communicating with a profound and sacred breath, taverns where the tables were almost tripods, and where was drunk what Ennius calls the Sibylline wine. The Faubourg Saint-Antoine is a reservoir of people. Revolutionary agitations create fissures there, through which trickles the popular sovereignty. This sovereignty may do evil. It can be mistaken like any other, but even when led astray, it remains great. We may say of it as of the blind Cyclops, ingens. In 93, according as the idea which was floated about was good or evil, according as it was the day of fanaticism or of enthusiasm, there leaped forth from the Faubourg Saint-Antoine now savage legions, now heroic bands. Savage. Let us explain this word. When these bristling men, who in the early days of the revolutionary chaos, tattered, howling, wild, with uplifted bludgeon, pike on high, hurled themselves upon ancient Paris in an uproar, what did they want? They wanted an end to oppression, an end to tyranny, an end to the sword, work for men, instruction for the child, social sweetness for the woman, liberty, equality, fraternity, bread for all, the idea for all, the Edenizing of the world, progress, and that holy, sweet, and good thing, progress, they claimed in terrible wise, driven by extremities as they were, half naked, club in fist, a roar in their mouths. They were savages, yes, but the savages of civilization. They proclaimed right furiously. They were desirous, if only with fear and trembling, to force the human race to paradise. They seemed barbarians, and they were saviors. They demanded light with the mask of night. Facing these men, who were ferocious, we admit, and terrifying, but ferocious and terrifying for good ends, there are other men, smiling, embroidered, gilded, beribboned, starred, in silk stockings, in white plumes, in yellow gloves, in varnished boots, who, with their elbows on a velvet table beside a marble chimney-piece, insist gently on demeanor and the preservation of the past, of the Middle Ages, of divine right, of fanaticism, of innocence, of slavery, of the death penalty, of war, glorifying in low tones and with politeness the sword, the stake, and the scaffold. For our part, if we were forced to make a choice between the barbarians of civilization and the civilized men of barbarism, we should choose the barbarians. But, thank heavens, still another choice is possible. No perpendicular fall is necessary in front any more than in the rear, neither despotism nor terrorism. We desire progress with a gentle slope. God takes care of that. God's whole policy consists in rendering slopes less steep. End of Book 1, Chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Book 1 of Volume 4 of Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 1, A Few Pages of History. Chapter 6. Enjolras and his Lieutenants. It was about this epoch when Enjolras, in view of a possible catastrophe, instituted a kind of mysterious census. All were present at a secret meeting at the Café Musain. Enjolras said, mixing his words with a few half-enigmatical but significant metaphors,
"It is proper that we should know where we stand and on whom we may count. If combatants are required, they must be provided. It can do no harm to have something with which to strike. Passers-by always have more chance of being gored when there are bulls on the road than when there are none. Let us therefore reckon a little on the herd. How many of us are there? There is no question of postponing this task until tomorrow. Revolutionists should always be hurried. Progress has no time to lose. Let us mistrust the unexpected. Let us not be caught unprepared. We must go over all the seams that we have made and see whether they hold fast. This business ought to be concluded today. Courfeyrac, you will see the Polytechnic students. It is their day to go out. Today is Wednesday. Fouilly, you will see those of the Glacier, will you not? Combeferre has promised me to go to Picpus. There is a perfect swarm and an excellent one there. Bahorel will visit the Estrapade. Prouvaire, the masons are growing lukewarm. You will bring us news from the lodge of the Rue de Grenville-Saint-Honoré. Joly will go to the Dupuytren's clinical lecture and feel the pulse of the medical school. Bossuet will take a little turn in the court and talk with the young law licentiates. I will take charge of the Cougourde myself.
That arranges everything, said Courfeyrac.
No.
What else is there?
A very important thing.
What is that? asked Courfeyrac.
The Barrière de Maine, replied Enjolras.
Enjolras remained for a moment as though absorbed in reflection. Then he resumed.
At the Barrière de Maine there are marble workers, painters, and journeymen in the studios of sculptors. They are an enthusiastic family, but liable to cool off. I don't know what has been the matter with them for some time past. They are thinking of something else. They are becoming extinguished. They pass their time playing dominoes. There is urgent need that someone should go and talk with them a little, but with firmness. They meet at Richelieu's. They are to be found there between 12 and 1 o'clock. Those ashes must be fanned into a glow. For that errand I had counted on that abstracted Marius, who is a good fellow on the whole, but he no longer comes to us. I need someone for the Barrière de Maine. I have no one."
"What about me?" said Grantaire. "Here am I."
"You!
I.
You indoctrinate Republicans? You warm up hearts that have grown cold in the name of principle?
Why not?
Are you good for anything?"
I have a vague ambition in that direction," said Grantaire.
"You do not believe in everything."
"I believe in you."
"Grantaire will do me a service?"
"Anything. I'll black your boots."
"Well, don't meddle with our affairs. Sleep yourself sober from your absinthe."
"You are an ingrate, Enjolras."
"You the man to go to the Barrière de Maine? You capable of it?"
"I am capable of descending the Rue de Gris, of crossing the Place Saint-Michel, of sloping through the Rue Monsieur le Prince, of taking the Rue de Vaugirard, of passing the Carmelites, of turning into the Rue d'Assas, of reaching the Rue de Cherche-Midi, of leaving behind me the Conseil de Guerre, of pacing the Rue de Veilleurs-Tuileries, of striding across the boulevard, of following the Chaussée de Maine, of passing the barrier and entering Richefeu's. I am capable of that. My shoes are capable of that."
"Do you know anything of those comrades who meet at Richefeu's?"
"Not much. We only address each other as thou."
"What will you say to them?"
"I will speak to them of Robespierre, Pardee, of Danton, of principles."
"You?"
"I. But I don't receive justice. When I set about it, I am terrible. I have read Prudhomme. I know the social contract. I know my Constitution of the year 2 by heart. The liberty of one citizen ends where the liberty of another citizen begins.
Do you take me for a brute?"
I have an old bank bill of the Republic in my drawer. The rights of man, the sovereignty of the people, sapristi. I am even a bit of a Hebertist.
I can talk the most superb twaddle for 6 hours by the clock, watch in hand. "Be serious," said Enjolras.
"I am wild," replied Grantaire. Enjolras meditated for a few moments, and made the gesture of a man who has taken a resolution.
"Grantaire," he said gravely, "I consent to try you. You shall go to the Barrière de Maine."
Grantaire lived in furnished lodgings very near the Café Musain. He went out, and 5 minutes later he returned. He had gone home to put on a Robespierre waistcoat. "Red," said he as he entered, and he looked intently at Enjolras. Then, with the palm of his energetic hand, he laid the 2 scarlet points of the waistcoat across his breast, and stepping up to Enjolras, he whispered in his ear, "Be easy." He jammed his hat on resolutely and departed. A quarter of an hour later, the back room of the Café Musain was deserted. All the friends of the ABC were gone, each in his own direction, each to his own task. Enjolras, who had reserved the Cougourde of Aix for himself, was the last to leave. Those members of the Cougourde of Aix who were in Paris then met on the plain of Issy, in one of the abandoned quarries which are so numerous in that side of Paris. As Enjolras walked toward this place, he passed the whole situation in review in his own mind. The gravity of events was self-evident. When facts, the premonitory symptoms of latent social malady, move heavily, the slightest complication stops and entangles them. A phenomenon whence rises ruin and new births. Enjolras descried a luminous uplifting beneath the gloomy skirts of the future. Who knows? Perhaps the moment was at hand. The people were again taking possession of right, and what a fine spectacle! The revolution was again majestically taking possession of France, and saying to the world, "The sequel to tomorrow." Enjolras was content. The furnace was being heated. He had at that moment a powder train of friends scattered all over Paris. He composed in his own mind, with Combeferre's philosophical and penetrating eloquence, Feuillet's cosmopolitan enthusiasm, Courfeyrac's dash, Bahorel's smile, Jean Prouvair's melancholy, Joly's science, Bousset's sarcasms, a sort of electric spark which took fire nearly everywhere at once. All hands to work. Surely the result would answer to the effort. This was well. This made him think of Grantaire. Hold, said he to himself. The Barrière de Maine will not take me far out of my way. What if I were to go on as far as Richefeu's? Let us have a look at what Grantaire is about, and see how he is getting on. 1 o'clock was striking at the Vaugirard steeple when Enjolras reached the Richefeu smoking-room. He pushed open the door, entered, folded his arms, letting the door fall to and strike his shoulders, and gazed at that room filled with tables, men, and smoke. A voice broke forth from the mist of smoke, interrupted by another voice. It was Grantaire holding a dialogue with an adversary. Grantaire was sitting opposite another figure at a marble Sainte-Anne table, strewn with grains of bran and dotted with dominoes. He was hammering the table with his fist, and this is what Enjolras heard. 6, 4s. The pig, I have no more. You are dead, a 2. 6, 3, 1. It's my move. 4 points. Not much. It's your turn. I've made an enormous mistake. You are doing well. 15. 7 more. That makes me 22. 22. You weren't expecting that 6. If I had placed it at the beginning, the whole play would have been changed. A 2 again. 1. 1. Well, 5. I haven't any. It was your play, I believe. Yes. Blank. What luck he has. You are lucky. 2. 1. Neither 5 nor 1. Now that's bad for you. Domino. Plague take it. End of chapter 6 of Book 1